Hello, my name's Caroline Warman, and I'm very pleased to be meeting you, even if it's remotely via my computer screen and your computer screen, and hello to you all. So you've been hearing about some really interesting stuff this week, and I thought that I would tell you what I work on. And I'm the French tutor. And what that means is that I teach everybody who's working here studying French. I teach them how to write in French, how to speak French, and how to read lots of French, and how to write about French books, plays, poems, short stories, novels, and everything in between. And when the students aren't in residence, I carry on doing that work with French writing, and I work myself on a French philosopher called Diderot. So this is the time at which I need to share my screen. So we'll see how I can manage that. So thank you for bearing with me while I do this. Okay, so I've called it intelligence à la française, French intelligence. Seems a bit silly, really, but anyway, I was just making up a title. So here's Diderot, who's the philosopher and writer that I work on. You see that portrait of him on the left is a very famous one from the 1760s, and he said it made him look like an old flirt, which I think is not untrue. He does have some rather bright makeup, and he looks rather sort of coquettish. In the middle there, you've got two busts. The one that's nearer you, looking more Roman, is Rousseau, another French philosopher and writer of the 18th century, looking typically a bit miserable. And next to him, behind him, is Diderot with that sort of quite big nose. I included that because those busts are both from the Taylorian, which is the Modern Languages Library in Oxford, and those busts are there in the same room, sort of looking at each other often. And the one on the right is a very famous one by Houdon. So I just wanted to show you, I suppose, well, what he looked like. And I suppose you can see as well that there are certain sort of marks of status. And Diderot thought a great deal about the body and the mind. He was very interested in what thought was. He wanted to know how this like pulpy stuff up here, protected by this hard thing, can create thoughts, can remember things, can write things, can speak. He wanted to know how it worked, absolutely from basics to the most complex. And that's what I want to tell you about his theories today. I suppose an important question might be, why are we looking at this, dead white male from the 18th century? You've heard plenty about current theories of what intelligence is, real intelligent, well, real and artificial. You've heard absolutely cutting edge stuff. So why are we going back? What's the point? And I suppose there are two main answers. One is that the sorts of things that Diderot was doing in the 18th century were really extraordinary for the context, and that in itself tells us a lot. And the other is that some of the questions that he asked in a very open and straightforward sort of a way have still not been answered. So there's two sort of answers to that question, and we'll come to them both. But let's start with the historical context, because of course you may all know really a great deal about France of the 18th century, but just in case you don't, let me tell you a few things which I think it's useful for you to know. So here are the three kings. of France in the 18th century. Louis XIV, Louis XV, and Louis XVI. So Louis XIV, XV, and XVI. They go from left to right. And I have to say, the pictures in the middle and on the right, so Louis XV and the 16th, have been elongated. So they just look like they must be 7 foot tall. In any case, the important thing that you need to know is that they were absolute monarchs, which means that they had all the power in the state. It was all vested in them. So it's not like the sort of system we have in the UK with checks and balances, whereby in fact the Queen has no direct power at all, no function in terms of making decisions. This is completely the opposite. Perhaps easiest to to consider that they were like tyrants, really, in the sense that they could do anything that they wanted. And perhaps it's also useful for you to know that there was no sense in which all French citizens or everybody who lived in France were equal. That's absolutely not at all the case. The idea of equality was developed in the 18th century, in part by Diderot, in part by Rousseau, in part by others, but it was developed in a void. So if you were a man in France of the 18th century, you had not rights, but you had an identity that was dependent on your social rank, on your religion, and on the amount of money that you had. If you were a woman, you might have some advantages arising from being a wealthy person, but otherwise you had no real separate identity at all. And there was one religion that was allowed, and it was the Roman Catholic religion. And to say anything against the king or against the religion was not only illegal, it was blasphemous. So you couldn't speak against monarchy or church. You couldn't criticize them. For example, recently you may have heard there's been some criticism of the government in relation to A-levels and what has been done. That would not be allowed. And anybody who criticized the government would be put in prison. And it may well be that the current government would like to put its critics in prison, but so far it does not have that power. But let me tell you about what France in the 18th century could do when it felt like it was being criticized, these key twin aspects of monarchy and religion. So, for example, Le Chevalier de la Barre, it's not a picture of him, it's a picture of a monument erected to him where he died in Abbeville. It's a very famous case. What happened was that he and some friends, they didn't take their hats off when a religious procession went past. You will be very shocked. And so were the people of Abbeville at the time. And when it was later noticed that some of the crucifixes, some of the public crucifixes had been defaced, or there'd been, I don't know what had happened exactly, they'd been sort of like carved into a bit, and that some copies of a very naughty book called Le Dictionnaire Philosophique, so the philosophical dictionary, was circulating. These people were arrested, some of them escaped. Le Chevalier de la Barre, who was 19 years old when he was arrested, did not manage to escape, and nobody managed to save him. He was condemned to death in a horrible manner, which I think we don't need to go into. And he was just a few months off his 21st birthday when he was executed. And he was executed with some of these books that he had been accused of circulating and selling, these naughty books, the Dictionnaire Philosophique by Voltaire. So I think I've got a picture of the Dictionnaire Philosophique portatif. That means the sort of portable philosophical dictionary by Voltaire. it says there that it was published in London. It wasn't published in London, that's pretend. And that the Roman date at the bottom, I don't know how good you are at, I'm not very good at working out Roman numerals, but it's 1764. And here's a page from the manuscript. So it's a dictionary. And here's what we find under the term âme, which is soul. C'est un terme vague, indéterminé, qui exprime un principe inconnu. It's a vague, undetermined term which expresses an unknown principle, and then on it goes. But so you see, I hope here, that this is meaningful in the sense that anybody who criticizes or is held to criticize anything connected to religion and faith needs to be is viciously punished, and here's the evidence. Also, there was a man called Damien who was apparently mentally unstable, and he attempted to kill the king, Louis XV, in 1757. And although he didn't really hurt the king at all, he was executed in an exemplary and unpleasant manner. Here's an engraving of it. See what they did is they tied horses to each of his limbs and then whipped the horses to go off in different directions. And this form of killing somebody took a long time. So my point is that the authorities are not messing. If you criticize or attempt to what is perceived as harm the monarchy or religion, you will be punished, and possibly in an extremely vicious manner. Okay, so where are we with respect to anything to do with intelligence? Let's come back to that question. So what the Catholic theologians said about intelligence was that it was part of the soul and that it was God-given, that it was unique, and that only human beings had it. So animals, for example, didn't have a soul, and so on. Diderot thought that this idea that intelligence was connected to the soul, or even that the soul existed, was complete nonsense. And this is what he wrote in the 1770s, so just in the decade following the death of Le Chevalier de la Barre. So I have given you the French. I know that you're not French students, but I like to put different languages up there. I'm going to read the French in the first case, and then I'll just leave it there and I'll just read the English instead. So, est-ce que l'âme est gaie, triste, colère, tendre, dissimulée, voluptueuse? Elle n'est rien sans le corps. Je défie qu'on explique rien sans le corps. So what that means is the soul happy, sad, angry, tender, furtive, pleasure-seeking? It is nothing without the body. I defy anyone to explain anything without the body. And he then goes on to say, l'animal est tout un, et c'est peut-être cette unité qui constitue l'âme, le soi, la conscience, à l'aide de la mémoire. The animal is a unified whole, and it is perhaps this unity which constitutes the soul, the self, consciousness, with the help of memory. So if you think in the context, what that means in terms of what he's defying, that's a great deal. So he's saying that thought and intelligence and feelings and emotion is bodily. It's not anything to do with the soul. And in fact, this was extremely brave of him to say in the 1770s. In 1746, his first book, which you can see on the screen there in front of you, called Pensée philosophique, was banned. And in fact, he wasn't executed, but his book was executed. This may seem ridiculous to you, but I will show you what the judgment said. So the Parliament had a court case against this book and judged that it was poison. So here I've naughtily not put the English, but you see the bit where where it's in bold. So le venin des opinions les plus criminelles. So what they said about the Pensée philosophique is that it had the poison of the most criminal and absurd opinions, and it was depraved, and it was the worst that human reason could possibly produce, the most depraved. And what in fact les Pensées philosophiques, the philosophical thoughts, discusses is whether how to believe, what sort of belief one should have. It just asks questions about that. And you see at the bottom there, you can see the name of the judgment. So I won't read it all out because you'll be getting irritated with all of the French. But basically, the Pensées philosophiques were condemned to be à être lacérés et brûlés, so to be lacerated, whipped, and burned by the executioner as scandalous and contrary to religion and to good morals. And that's what they literally gathered the books, whipped them, and burned them. So yes, there are high stakes around theories of the mind and theories of thought in France of the 18th century. There is one truth that is accepted and acceptable by and to the authorities, and that is the religious truth. And Diderot's view was completely against that. His idea of knowledge was that it was not determined by religion, that it should not be censored, that it should be freely available, that it should never be punished, that knowledge couldn't be punished. And he really put his money where his mouth was in editing, co-editing this book, the Encyclopedia, Dictionnaire raisonné des sciences, des arts et des métiers. So the Encyclopedia, or reasoned dictionary of the sciences, of the skills and arts. So les arts doesn't necessarily mean art in the current way that we understand it. Et des métiers, which is trades. So science is not sciences in our current English understanding. It means branches of knowledge. And there are a good number of these volumes. I think you can see there, the picture shows you that. There's 17 volumes of text and 11 volumes of plates. And he co-edited it with this famous mathematician called D'Alembert. Now all of this incredible book is online. Now let me show you. I took this off the I just took it off the internet yesterday to show you. So on the left you can see part of the article about the esprit, which is I can see my face is above third meaning. It means the esprit means spirit, it means wit, and it also means the mind. So this is the bit about the mind, and I'm not going to read all of that out. I think we don't need to. What I want to show you is something really, it's a sort of like parenthesis to this talk about intelligence, but it's something really interesting about the Encyclopedia, which is that it had lots and lots of cross references, and so you could go from one article to another article, and what we now think of course, in our internet brains as links. So if you see on the left-hand side, you look at the 18th century sort of typeface, you can see on the second line, it says, voyez, pensez. That means see, thought. And every time it says voyez, it means cross-reference. So go to the other article. So it starts connecting up knowledge in new ways. So it's got voyez, pensez there. And then at the end of the third paragraph, you've got voyez Dieu, ange et âme. That means see God, angel and soul. And then at the end of the following paragraph, voyez raisonnement et jugement, see reasoning and judgment. And in the online version, of course, those are now linked. You can see on the right hand side, you can just click on the red words. So you can see how this idea of mind goes in some very interesting and different directions, to thought and also to religious areas, God, angel, soul, reasoning and judgment. That's all quite connected. So let's focus in more on what the idea of intelligence is. And this is from the introduction to the Encyclopedia. I can see that my face is over the top of Encyclopedia. Sorry about that. Now this is, so D'Alembert wrote the Discours Préliminaire, the preliminary discourse. And I just took to the Encyclopedia, you know, what the Encyclopedia was trying to do, what it was about and its principles. And I thought I would extract this particular section because it shows its principles. So let me just read out the English bit on the right. It is perhaps true that there is almost no branch of knowledge and no skill or art that one cannot, with care and clear logic, teach the most limited mind. This is because there are very few sorts of knowledge whose propositions or rules cannot be reduced to simple notions and ordered with such clarity that the chain will never be broken. The greater or lesser the speed of the mind, the shorter or longer the chain required. And the advantage the greatest geniuses have is nothing other than to need it less than others, or rather to join the links with greater rapidity and almost without noticing. So I'm not quite sure how clear that is to you. What D'Alembert means is that all of us can understand everything as long as that everything is explained in clear steps, so links of the chain. They always think in terms of a chain and of links, so one link to the next link. It's always very, very logical. And what he's saying is that a genius can just go through all of those links, make those steps faster than somebody who is not a genius, i.e., intelligence is not a thing that some people have and other people don't have. It's not about that. It's simply about speed. And I think this is an amazingly open-minded, helpful and also accurate way of thinking about what intelligence is. It's certainly matched by my experience as a teacher. Everybody can get there, but just takes some people a little bit more time. They need to see what the connections are. And often you may have, like me, perhaps in the past, struggled with maths. And maths is always a thing where if only the teacher can explain to you how you get from A to B and all the ways along, you can get it. You can get every single link. But if they're making jumps because it's obvious to them, then it's much harder for you to follow. So this is what the Encyclopedia thought. It thought that everybody can understand everything, and it was its job to try and explain it. So with that in mind, let's have a look at the Éléments de Physiologie. So this is his late work about physiology, which he wrote in the 1770s and which I've just finished a book on. I'm not going to tell you everything about it because I think otherwise we'd be here for 3 weeks and you'd have been fast asleep for most of the time. But so let me just have a little look at some of the things that it's doing. So he really wants, as I said at the beginning, what Diderot really, really wants to do is understand how the body works and how the mind works, what it all means.
in the absence of a soul. So he says, if it's there, if it's physical and it's there, then it's body. If it's not physical, then he doesn't believe that it exists. So here, in this section here, he's trying to work out how judgment first arises. So we're going to be looking at judgment, and then we're going to look at how things can be compared, and then we're going to turn again to the question of genius, and then we'll have a few questions to think about at the end. So I'll just read the English here, which I hope I've translated clearly. Objects act on the senses. The sensation lasts for a while in the sensory organ. The senses act on the brain. This action lasts for a while. No sensation is simple or momentary, for, if I may put it this way, it's a bundle. From this arises thought and judgment. What does he mean? When he says it's a bundle, he's thinking in the sort of terminology that you may be familiar with from when people say things like, oh, she's a bundle of nerves. It's this idea that there's lots of sensations happening at the same time. So there's more than one thing all being layered up. So one has a sensation which lasts for an amount of time. The sensation gets fed through to the brain, and all then works together. So let's see if he can explain that a bit more clearly. So I'm going to read just the English again, but leave the French there for you to have a look at in case you're interested. We make judgments. That's a fact. How are judgments formed? This is the phenomenon that needs explaining. He's talking here about sensations. So for the reason that they last a while, there is coexistence of sensations. You can't, it's almost impossible to have only one sensation at a time, right? The animal feels this coexistence. I told you he was interested not just in humans, but also in animals, or in humans as a sort of animal, not as something like super special, often its own special area with God. Now, to feel two things at once is to make a judgment. The judgment is formed and the voice speaks it out loud. The man says, white wall, and there's the judgment pronounced. Okay, so stay with me a moment. It's going to become, I hope, a bit clearer. The thing becomes even easier to think about if the objects are actually present. There's a wall, and I say wall. And while I'm pronouncing this word, I see it as white, and I say white. So that's why you get the white wall. Now, what is done in the presence of objects, so when they're actually there, happens in exactly the same way when they're absent, when the imagination replaces or substitutes them. So you can, look around, you can look at your computer and describe your computer. Imagine you had a sparkly computer. So that's describing the object and a quality of the object, and you're saying it at the same time, right? So you're saying that the computer is sparkly. You're doing two things. Diderot says that's a process of the mind, and it's to do with sensation and how you receive it and how the mind processes it. So there's nothing sort of super special. There's nothing magic about it. It's sensation, one sensation, two sensation being processed. And here he goes on to talk about this question of speed. I mentioned that before in what D'Alembert was saying, that what separates a normal person from a genius is how fast they go through all of these steps. Speed is the characteristic of genius. I'm quoting here, yes. A person
is useless at one thing, but excels at another. If you see the thing as it is in nature, you are a philosopher. If you put the object together from a choice of separate parts and thereby make the sensation it creates more intense than it would have been in nature, then you are a poet. So, so he's talking here about seeing things accurately without adding anything, just observing them absolutely clearly, and therefore being a philosopher. And then what it means to be a poet. He doesn't say that the person who puts together in their mind different aspects of something and then enhances or intensifies one part is just getting it wrong. He doesn't say that at all. He says that the person who does that is a poet. They're making the sensation stronger. So these are the questions that I would like to think about with you, and possibly we can talk about them once you've watched this. So is Diderot thinking about intelligence as a comparative thing, i.e. somebody who is intelligent and somebody who isn't intelligent in that sort of like a hierarchy? Or is he thinking about the workings of the intellect, like actually the processes of it? What do you think? My next question, do you agree with him and with D'Alembert that the difference between genius and stupidity is simply a question of speed? And I suppose another question connected to that is, having thought about this idea that all knowledge is accessible to everybody as long as it's clearly enough explained, whether you even think that it's possible for anybody to lack intelligence. My next question, perhaps you already have read it because there it is on the screen. Do you think that you are a philosopher or a poet? And which one would you rather be? I mean, Diderot separates them. Of course, he himself is really a poet philosopher. Do you agree that judgment arises from experiencing more than one sensation at once? And how would you describe thought? And I do think that the further down that list of questions we get, seemingly to more simple questions, the harder the answers become. And I don't know whether you've done this sort of philosophy or not. Any of you who have studied philosophy might well have asked yourself or been asked these sorts of questions. But it's absolutely the case that the simpler the question, the more basic it is, the more challenging it is. Where would you even begin to start thinking about these sorts of questions? So to come back to the question of intelligence à la française, you know, the title of my little talk here, and why it is that reading Diderot can help us think about intelligence, even though he wrote 250 years ago. And obviously people have been thinking about these questions since, and there are more up-to-date scientific answers to the sorts of questions that he's posing. I think two things. I think it's really important to go back to this time when the sorts of foundations of our modern world were first being laid. So it's people like Diderot, and not just in France, but also in Scotland in particular, Germany, Italy, America, perhaps slightly less so England, we're really thinking about these questions. And And our understanding of the human body and the human mind really develops from these first sorts of questions, from these thinkers. Of course, you can take the chain further backward. You can start in the Middle Ages, or you can start in antiquity. You could start with Aristotle. But here we are with Diderot at the very beginning, or in the midst of the scientific revolution, and before specialization, when you've got people who teach, for example, French thought, like me, or you've got people who, like Matt, who teach political theory, or Nigel, who works on artificial intelligence. So we're all now, in the modern world, modern universities, we're all in separate departments. But in the 18th century, they didn't have universities. Of course, Oxford, places like Oxford say, we were founded in 1263 or whatever sort of stuff. It was not found, yes, is the argument, but they were founded as theological training colleges. And and Jesus College was founded to train Anglican ministers from Wales to work in Wales. So there it was a training college for priests, which is not the same as how we think of a university now. It's specifically not to do with that. It's to do with learning about knowledge of all different sorts. So exactly the shift that Diderot was part of in the mid-18th century with the Encyclopedia, away from theology as knowledge and as the thing to be taught, to everything, all branches of knowledge, all skills, all arts, everything, as something accessible to everybody. That's the moment at which it happens. He's part of pushing that. And now one could argue that we're too far separated, in our specialisms. What do I know about artificial intelligence? Can I code a computer? No. And what do other people know about Diderot? Not much, perhaps. But so this is what I'm saying is, we can go back to those foundations and understand where we've come from, what the questions that were first asked were, and also perhaps we can go back to those questions and ask them again, and be bold enough to ask them without feeling we have to learn them from somebody else. We can think about it. How would you describe thought? What do you think it is? So I think that's the end of what I wanted to say to you. I hope you found it interesting, and I hope I have been clear, and that I've taken you along with me from one link to the next. I'm now going to stop the video, and perhaps we'll be able to do some form of online discussion. Bye.